Welcome, everybody, to June's edition of Property Watch, where we look at what's been happening to Australia's property market as a result of the coronavirus impacts. And I wanted to start with this very positive and cute little picture that we've all got this. Right now, it's the 2nd of June, and it feels like we've come out at the end of a very bad nightmare. So we still have to clean up afterwards, but let's have a look at what's been happening and how the market has fared. So this presentation will really cover a couple of things. One is an update on the economy over the last month of May, and as a result, what the impact on the property market and therefore property value is. And finally, just some ideas of options you can take today to help your own situation. And once again, as a disclaimer, very long disclaimer that please assess your own situation, and this information is general in nature. So let's dig into it. What happened in the month of May in terms of the economy? So, as expected, because of quarantining and all of the restrictions that the government's introduced, business activity significantly reduced. Therefore, as a result of having business is really as a backbone and the driver economy, the reduction in the revenue ultimately affects the income of everyday Aussies, and therefore income of households, as the number of hours worked by everybody reduced. And we'll see that in the next couple of slides. So the latest data shows that about 72% of all businesses in Australia had decreased revenue as a result of the coronavirus. And uh, there's a very small percentage, therefore, where the revenue actually increased, only 7%, which means, the rest, the bulk, 93% of the entire business activity would either decrease or stagnant as a result of coronavirus, which is pretty horrible. And the data that's coming out this month, actually this week, is pretty much indicating the beginning of a recession in the Australia economy, because the gross domestic product, or the GDP, of the first quarter of this year has decreased compared to previous years, therefore signaling the start of an official recession. And what's been happening to businesses as we look forward? So because of the current restrictions, which are starting to ease, but businesses are anticipating that the social distancing will continue to impact their business activity. So about 71% of businesses expect their businesses to be impacted, which means reduced revenue most likely, as a result of the restrictions. And so 63% from trading restrictions. And right now, there's still no open international travel and very limited interstate travel. So about half of all businesses will be impacted by the travel restrictions. So by being very homebound, so people have really, especially parents, have felt the pressure of really homeschooling their kids over the last couple of months, and also working from home. So it's been a juggling act for everybody. So people are trying to keep their incomes intact, as well as looking after their kids, and also adapting to the new working conditions from home. And as a result of that, about 22% of workers reduced or changed their working hours, which once again contributes to the reduction in overall job effectiveness and worker efficiency in the workplace. So what does that actually mean? So I'm just going to move my face out of the way a bit. That means overall we saw over from the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, you can see there on the graph in the beginning of March to really early May, there's been a clear decrease in the number of jobs on the market, as well as the amount of total pay on the market, which comes really at no surprise to most people because of the current situation of the economy. And let's now dig into this extremely important graph, which looks at unemployment, the main thing that's been on the news and on everybody's minds. And ultimately, what is a key indicator on what will happen to the Australian economy. So, unemployment is the line that you see in the blue. So unemployment has definitely increased. This is a long graph over the last 20 years. So if you look at the very end of the graph there, so unemployment over the last 20 years has been relatively stable at around, about anywhere between 4 to 6%. But right now, if you look at, April 2020, there's really the tail of this snake or line has really started to spike upwards. So unemployment is increasing, which is what everybody, all the chief economists from Westpac, AMP, and also the RBA have all anticipated. RBA being the Reserve Bank of Australia have all anticipated increases in unemployment, unfortunately. But what's more interesting are the other graphs that the news doesn't report and doesn't highlight, which actually gives you even more insight in what's happening with the economy. So I'll just explain what they are. So if you look at the second line, it's actually what's called the underemployment rate. So what underemployment rate is defined as in the Australian Bureau of Statistics and also the Reserve Bank of Australia defines it as people that are employed but are doing something that's not fulfilling their potential, right? So if someone has a university degree, but they're doing manual labor work, for example, so that would be counted as underemployment. So essentially, they're not working at a level that's consistent with their training or education. So what that shows us, which if you look at the graph for April 2020 compared to the previous 20 years, clearly spiked up significantly from, let's just take April 2019, from around 8% there to all the way to nearly 14% in April 2020. So what that shows us is people are having to settle essentially for employment just to make ends meet, right? So if there's a job that you might be qualified to be an engineer, or you might be qualified to be a pilot or something that you're trained for, but right now to pay the bills and make ends meet, you're having to take whatever job that really comes your way. So people are seemingly doing that. And finally, the underutilization rate, which is that graph there in the green, shows how much talent there is or how much potential workers there is overall in the Australian workforce. And that includes people that are currently not even counted as labor force. So they are not, they haven't been employed in the last couple of years. For example, people who are stay-at-home moms who have left the workforce for a couple of years, but they're clearly able workers, right? So the green line shows the overall possibility of workers who are not actively working or working at a level that's consistent with their skills. So overall, if you look at that, that's increased from about 14% all the way now to about 20%, an increase in 6%. So if you think about it from the overall Australian workforce, so about 20% of people are underutilized. So that means the Australian workforce is now extremely inefficient, and a lot of people are having to settle, and therefore, really the pain of income and employment is just starting with this huge spike in all three indicators. So what does that mean now as we move to the property market? So, and this is all fresh data. So we're really looking at what's happening. And today being Tuesday, the latest update from the Reserve Bank is that they've kept the cash rate the same at 0.25%, which is an all-time low. So if let's have a look at what's actually been happening to the property market nationwide. So this is data over the month of May. And if you have a look, overall national prices decreased 0.4%. And if you have a quick browse over the capital cities, pretty much all the prices have reduced or have remained stagnant. And the city that took the biggest hit is Melbourne, being a key capital city. If you include Darwin, then Darwin is definitely taking the heaviest hit. Um, but essentially, this is pretty much what everybody expected and therefore has come true because of the reduction in economic activity and therefore the reduction in property transactions in May. However, let's look at maybe what's been positive and recovering, because definitely compared to April, there's been a lot more easing of restrictions and people have adapted to this new way of operating virtually and online. And this is more clearly shown in the auction clearance activity. So this is really data by CoreLogic over mid to early May. And compared to this time last year, the actual overall number of auctions have decreased significantly, but the clearance rates in how people are holding these auctions has actually been not particularly horrible. So if you have a look at the beginning of May, the rates were even up, clearance rates were even up around 75%. It's been a little bit inconsistent during the month, with a huge drop there with the late May, around the 20th of May. But if you look at the average graph, so essentially the dark line is actually the average over 4 weeks, and the lighter blue line is what the actual clearance rate on that week was. So if you look at the average compared to the actual data, there hasn't been a crazy amount of variation, which means that the auction market is actually relatively on track. So properties are being sold at auctions. It's just that it's been clearly impacted by all of the quarantine restrictions and social distancing. So the number of auctions have decreased. And then if we look at one of the things that really affects property value is consumer sentiment. So there's a very historical, strong correlation between how people are feeling about the market, whether they're feeling good, positive about the market, and the impact of that on property prices. So if people are feeling great, usually prices for property are higher, and people are feeling a little bit depressed and down, usually property prices then become lower. So if we have a look at what's been happening to consumer sentiment over the last, this is really over the last 2 years, 100%, essentially the red line you see there would be when people are fairly positive and neutral about the market. So people have felt pretty positive until really the second half of 2019. So the sentiment has already started to reduce after about June 2019, but clearly due to the coronavirus crisis, if you have a look at post November 19 there, the sharp dip there around April from March is due to the coronavirus. However, you notice there is an upswing on that sentiment in May. So what that means is people are feeling more positive about the market and therefore potential resumption of business activity and potential recovery in the Australian economy. So this is a very positive sign. However, we are still below 100. So I guess the next couple of months we'll see what happens to this graph, but noting that definitely potentially property prices have been impacted, as we have seen, which correlates well with this graph. But we'll see what happens to the property prices as they continue to be impacted over the next couple of months. And this is just really fresh off the press over the last couple of days. The University of Melbourne have done a forecasting study to what will happen to housing prices, as well as the amount of equity, so the amount of cash value people have in their property. So they projected that out in the next couple of quarters. And I mean, really what it shows from their modeling is not fantastic. So they predict, quite significant decreases in the pricing of houses. So they broke that down into different cities. So they predict about a negative, about 4.5% decrease in the second quarter of 2020, and a further decrease of more than 2% in the third quarter of 2020 for all cities in Australia. But if you look at the key capital cities of Sydney and Melbourne, Melbourne is predicted to take a key hit. And this actually corresponds to the graph that we saw before with the map of Australia, where Melbourne was the worst affected key capital. So their prediction has been pretty accurate so far. Um, and Sydney and Perth are also pretty heavily affected, with Perth being also similar to Melbourne, reduction in property prices of more than 5%, and then Sydney of a overall reduction in house prices of around -4%, and that decrease in house prices will continue from what I can see here for the third quarter, which is that light blue bar. And they also did this for people's home equity values. So this is for people who actually hold mortgages on their houses. And if you have a look, so the important data here is to focus on that sort of aqua blue bar, which is a medium change, and the dark navy bar is a change in home value. And the other two are just sort of worst case scenarios with the green bar, and the other, I would say, sort of like purplish blue bar. So if you look at the various states, WA seems like the state to be worst hit as a result of the coronavirus crisis, that overall home equity, so the amount of cash value people have in their home, as well as home prices, will decrease the most, followed by Melbourne and Sydney. So this is fresh modeling. Well, once again, it's a prediction of what will happen. So we will see what will happen in the next couple of months once June ends, to see whether this is fulfilled. But data from May so far has corresponded very well with their model. So I guess the news that, articles that you see that house prices will drop by 20% and 30%. If you have a look at their worst case scenario, which is that purplish blue bar, the fourth bar for each city or state, yes, it is potentially possible. So if you look at Perth or WA, actually, potentially people's equity values could drop by even up to more than 40%. But once again, this is a worst case scenario prediction. So if you have a look, worst case scenario for Melbourne and Sydney, sure, they could, people's home value, equity value could drop by around 20%. But the likelihood, if you actually read the little key there, is a bottom 10 percentile change. So it's a very small number of houses that could be exposed to that change. So always check your facts when you're reading the news. So maybe don't believe that it's all going to be doom and gloom. The reality could be this, no change, some change, or great change. But that is all yet to be seen. So what is happening with the government as a result of all of the, I guess, economic impacts and property market impacts? So Australia is entering recession now. Therefore, the Reserve Bank of Australia is being urged by chief economists of major banks to consider adopting a negative interest rate. What that means is that would drive the mortgage rate on people's home loans to even lower levels. Right now, 0.25 is the official cash rate. That doesn't always translate to having 0.25% on your mortgage loans, right? So therefore, by decreasing that cash rate even further, it's an encouragement for actual commercial banks to decrease their mortgage rates further. Therefore, the idea is to stimulate economic activity. We will see whether the RBA is open to that, but from all of their press releases and commentary, they seem to be not open to this idea. So even the US, I think the lowest they have adopted is 0% rather than going negative. And we go into a whole fun discussion going from inflation to deflation if they ever go into negative territory about the interest rate. So, and uh, if you don't understand what deflation is, just know that it's not good for the Australian economy. If you look at what the case study of Japan and what happened to them post World War II, and the biggest impact on people everyday lives from what the government is doing is really their assistance schemes, job seeker and job keeper. So a refresh if you don't know this like the back of your hand already. Job seeker is for people who have lost their jobs, lost their source of income, and is therefore encouraged to look for another source of income. And job keeper for people who still have their jobs and their companies and employers don't want to let them go, but the companies and businesses have applied for a subsidy from the government to keep paying um, people's wages and salaries every week. So those schemes are temporary, right? So they are due to end in late September. So the key question for the government and the economy and everybody is what will happen next, right? People are currently living off of all of these subsidies and grants. And because of the coronavirus situation, the grants are actually a little bit higher than usual to keep everybody's sense of normalcy, as for going for as long as possible. But once that ends in September, what is everybody going to do? Right now it's already beginning of June. So do people have 3 months or more to find another job or find another income? And noting at the beginning of our presentation that over 76 of businesses have experienced a reduction in revenue, can they actually find employment? So it's a whole related cycle of unemployment, reduction in business activity, and therefore what will actually happen to people's everyday living standards. And right now, on the property front, the federal government have been talking about potentially offering buyers of new homes of at least $20,000 to really restart and boost the construction activity in Australia. But once again, if people's, this is for everyday Aussies, if people are having issues surviving, then their thoughts, on purchasing new property could be last on their list. But for existing investors or people who are first home buyers who are already planning to buy and that haven't lost their jobs, that could be a really great opportunity as well to get into the property market. But really, right now, the key question is what will happen when the government subsidies end? Will they continue the subsidies from what currently the Prime Minister is indicating that he actually wants to end the payments earlier rather than later? That is not indicating that he will extend the programs. But we will see. We'll see if people's political influence and pressures prevail. But once again, out of our everyday Aussie control. So let's talk about what is actually within your control and what you can do today about your property. So the really, we've talked about the economy, we talked about the property market. Right now, when it comes down to you and your own property situation, is the key question is what are your priorities right now? So everybody's different. Some people's priorities will be on just really keeping your income coming in, cash flow, and therefore keeping all of the mortgage payments, keeping the bills happening, keeping the food on the table, and keeping a good credit rating. Investors who have cash in the bank or equity in investment properties and other assets may think about, well, really my priority right now is to keep my assets, not lose my all the wealth I've built, and potentially look at investing because right now prices of properties have decreased. So right now, I think you just need to question, as what I was saying, what is out of your direct control: the economy, the property market, you as the individual have very limited direct impact on that. So right now is a good time to ask what is within your control, starting with what's your personal priority, and what's your priority could be different to your partner's priority, to your friend's priority, to the rest of the family's priority. So it's important to get clarity on what's important to you. And to help you, you know, focus on your priority, important things like what's your current cash flow? Where are you now? It's important to know in order to get to where you are. So some people go, well, I want to be, having 10 properties in 10 years. But right now, where are you? Like right now, do you even have one property? Right now, do you have two properties? Or right now, you're just like, I'm not even thinking about properties right now. I just want to keep the property I have. Or right now, I'm renting and I just want to keep a roof over my head. Maybe right now it's a good time to do a quick taking into account exercise and ask yourself, what is your current cash flow? What is the amount of cash going into your bank account every week? Or you can do that on a monthly basis versus how much you have to pay every week or every month in terms of your mortgage, your bills, taxes, liabilities. And comes down to our next line, which is assets versus liabilities. How much do you own in terms of assets? And that could be a property or shares or really government bonds, anything of financial value that you own. It could be or invested as part of your superannuation, SMSF, versus how much liabilities you have in terms of, once again, mortgage is definitely a liability, credit cards, personal loans, car loans, maybe business loans if you have a business. And once you know where you are, right? So if your income and cash flow is enough to cover most of your key expenses, you should be relatively okay. But whether, you know, your expenses may be a lot greater than your income, therefore, you need assistance. But, even if your income is, enough to cover expenses, you could still be in feeling the pinch right now just because of all the pressure from the economy and maybe pressure on your job or your business. So therefore, from all of the government schemes that have been introduced, we talked about before, have you looked into the government grants yet? And if you have any sorts of loans, mortgage, have you already spoken to your bank or credit provider for some help? And then once again, in bold there, we said, please note applicability criteria because sometimes you will be assessed. So if people say that I have been impacted by coronavirus, then sometimes these institutions will need evidence that your income has been impacted, which is why the what's your cash flow exercise that we have here on this page is very useful because it helps you get your bank statements ready, get all your bills ready. So if you do need to apply for assistance from the government or the bank, you have all of the statements there to go, great, see this, yeah, I've been impacted, please help me. And finally, you know look at other sources of help. Do you have an accountant, a legal professional you can speak to about your situation? Definitely, we will encourage you to speak to an expert in the area. And that brings us to really the end of our webinar. So hopefully this has educated you. And because we are really experts in property development, property investment, and renovations, we are offering for the first 10 contacts in June 2020, a free consultation session worth $150. So what that means is if you have any questions about what's the impact of the economy and the property market on you and your property, what you can do with it, if you are experiencing any mortgage difficulties in paying your mortgage, and even with the bank assistance, you're still struggling with the bills or anything else, now we can potentially help you with a free session on coming up with a strategy for your life. And all you have to do is call us on our toll-free number there, 1-800-960-158, or give us an email at support@creatopia.com.au. We shall continue our Property Watch series as the corona impacts roll out throughout the rest of the year, and keep you updated of the latest impacts. Or if you have any questions about the particular webinar that we just did, definitely feel free to call us and email us as well. Leave us a comment in Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, any of our channels, and we'll definitely get back to you within 2 business days. And look forward to getting a lot of your engagement and contact. Have a fantastic rest of your week, everybody. And the sunshine is now already at the end of the tunnel, and we can already see the light. Now let's hopefully as a country work towards it as fast as we can. So take care.